On a December morning in 1980, one of the richest women in America was found unconscious on the marble floor of her own bathroom. She would never wake up again, and she would not die either. Not for another 28 years. She was an heiress to a fortune so vast it could not be spent in 10 lifetimes. A real-life princess by her first marriage. A fixture of the most glittering rooms in New York and Newport. And for nearly 3 decades, she lay silent in a hospital bed while the world argued, viciously, over a single question. Did she fall? Or was she pushed across the line between life and death by someone who stood to inherit everything? How does a woman, with every advantage on earth, end up frozen for 28 years, neither living nor dead, at the center of the most sensational mystery of her age? This is the story of the Crawford fortune, and of the woman it made and unmade. Martha Sharp Crawford, known to everyone with terrible irony as Sunny. Her father built an empire and died when she was 4 years old, leaving a little girl one of the wealthiest people in America. He believed money was protection. His daughter would spend her life discovering it was the opposite. A father who died too soon and left a fortune with no one to guard it. A fairy tale marriage to a prince that quietly rotted from the inside. And a second husband, accused, then convicted, then acquitted, of trying to kill her for her money, in a trial that gripped the world and answered nothing. Watch this not as a courtroom drama. Watch it as the question every great fortune eventually forces. When you are worth this much, can anyone around you ever want you? Or only what happens when you're gone? And remember one small object, a black leather bag, the kind a doctor carries. We will come back to what was found inside it. Begin not with Sunny, but with the man who made her rich and then vanished from her life before she could remember his face. His name was George W. Crawford, and he was a builder of invisible empires. In the early decades of the 20th century, as America wired itself for the modern age, fortunes were waiting for any man ruthless and far-sighted enough to control the thing the new century could not live without. Power, electricity, gas, the utilities that lit the cities and ran the factories. Crawford was that kind of man, sharp, driven, self-made. And he climbed to the chairmanship of a great utilities empire, amassing a fortune that placed him among the genuinely rich men of his era. Picture the world he built. A Pittsburgh of steel smoke and electric light, a city whose every glowing window depended, in some small way, on men like him. He had married late to a woman named Annie Laurie Womack, herself from Moan. Why? And in 1931, when Crawford was already an older man, they had a single child, a daughter, their only one. She arrived with such a cheerful, beaming temperament that the household began calling her Sunny. The name stuck for life. And here is the conviction at the root of the entire dynasty, the secret belief that would shape everything. George Crawford had spent his life learning that money was security, that a fortune large enough was a wall against every danger the world could throw at you. Poverty, helplessness, vulnerability, fear. He had built that wall higher than almost anyone. And he intended his beloved little girl to live her whole life safe behind it, protected by wealth from every hardship he had ever known. We will return to how completely that belief failed her. Because in 1935, when Sunny was just 4 years old, George Crawford died. The protector was gone, and the wall of money he left behind, an estate reported at around $75 million, an immense fortune for the time, now stood around a 4-year-old girl with no father behind it. The fortune was intact. The man who built it to keep her safe was in the ground. She would grow up the richest little orphan in America, and she would spend the rest of her life learning that a wall of money does not keep danger out. Sometimes it draws danger in. The fortune George Crawford left did not shrink. It grew, and it built around Sunny a life of almost unimaginable privilege. She was raised by her mother and a retinue of staff in the rarefied world of America's truly wealthy. Grand homes, European travel, private tutors, the finest schools, the careful grooming of a girl who would one day take her place at the very top of society. She was by every account a sweet and gentle child. Shy, soft-spoken, kind, eager to please, with none of the hardness her self-made father had needed to build the empire she inherited. By the time she came of age, Sunny Crawford was one of the most eligible heiresses in the United States. Her fortune was estimated in the tens of millions and would grow, over her lifetime, into the hundreds of millions. She was tall, blonde, beautiful, and impeccably mannered, and she carried behind it all an immense quantity of money that made her one of the great matrimonial prizes of two continents. And so, as such women did in that world, she went to Europe, to the old aristocracy, where ancient titles and new American money had been quietly marrying each other for generations. In 1957, in one of the great society events of the year, Sonny Crawford married Prince Alfred von Auersperg, a handsome Austrian aristocrat. The American utilities heiress became, overnight, a genuine princess. They had two children, a daughter, Annie Laurie, called Alla, born in 1958, and a son, Alexander, born in 1959. On paper, it was a fairy tale. The shy, gentle, fabulously rich American girl had become a European princess with a castle, a title, and two beautiful children. But look closely at the arrangement, because it is the founder's doctrine, playing out exactly as he might have feared. Sonny had not been chosen for her sharp wit or her ambition. She had little of either, and wanted little of either. She was gentle and passive and trusting. What she brought to the table, the thing that made an Austrian prince cross an ocean to marry her, was the fortune. From her very first marriage, the pattern of her life was set. She was loved, courted, and won, but always with the money standing in the room beside her, impossible to separate from the woman herself. The marriage to the prince, glamorous as it looked, was already quietly failing, and the fairy tale was about to introduce its second act, and the man at the center of the mystery. Stand in the early 1960s, at the height of Sonny's gilded life, and the image is dazzling. A real princess, a fortune in the hundreds of millions, homes on two continents, a title, a castle, two golden children. She moved through the most exclusive circles on earth, the resorts, the galas, the old courts of Europe, and the new aristocracy of New York. Photographers caught her, tall and serene and beautiful, gliding through rooms most people only read about. She had, by any measure the world recognized, everything. Picture her at the center of it, blonde, elegant, soft-spoken, draped in the kind of effortless wealth that needs no announcement. The richest little orphan in America had grown into a European princess, and the fortune her father built had carried her to a height almost no one ever reaches. The wall of money had done exactly what George Crawford intended. It had lifted his daughter clear above the ordinary dangers of the world. And here is the cruelty hidden photograph. At the very summit of that glittering life, Sonny von Auersperg was already a profoundly lonely woman in a marriage going cold, a gentle soul surrounded by people drawn, in the end, to her fortune. She had reached the top of the world, and there was no one up there with her who loved her for herself. The zenith was real, and it was the loneliest place she had ever stood. Look closely at Sonny herself. Behind the title and the jewels, and the wound that would define her whole life is already visible. She was, by every account, painfully shy, a quiet, retiring woman who disliked the spotlight, avoided confrontation, and wanted, more than anything, simply to be loved and to keep the peace. She drank. She leaned, increasingly, on prescription medications and on a private, secluded life. Beneath the serene surface was a fragile, passive, deeply unhappy person who had never, since the age of 4, had a strong protector of her own. And this is the vulnerability the fortune created. Sonny had been raised to be decorative, gentle, and trusting, never to be tough, never to guard herself, never to suspect the motives of the charming people who surrounded her. Her father's wall of money had been meant to protect her. Instead, it had raised her to be the perfect victim, enormously wealthy, emotionally fragile, conflict-averse, and constitutionally unable to imagine that anyone close to her might wish her harm. She was a gentle woman sitting on a fortune, with no one to guard her and no instinct to guard herself. And in 1966, a new man entered her life. His name was Claus von Bülow. Danish-born, brilliant, charming, impeccably mannered, a man who moved through high society with the polished ease of someone who belonged there. He was handsome, witty, and ambitious. And in 1966, after Sonny's first marriage finally collapsed, she married him. To the world, it looked like the gentle heiress had finally found a sophisticated, devoted husband to stand beside her. To history, it was the beginning of the most famous unsolved mystery in American high society. Because 14 years later, Sonny von Bülow would lie down in her own home and, in effect, never get up again. For a time, the second marriage looked like the happy ending the first one never delivered. Claus von Bülow gave up his own career to manage Sonny's affairs and stand beside her in the role of devoted society husband. They lived in spectacular style, a vast apartment on Fifth Avenue in New York, and, above all, Clarendon Court, a magnificent oceanfront mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, the summer capital of old American money. In 1967, they had a daughter, Cosima. Sonny now had 3 children, 2 homes most people couldn't imagine, and a charming, attentive husband. And this is exactly where the story lulls you. The Newport mansion, the Fifth Avenue apartment, the devoted husband who'd given up his own ambitions to care for her. You look at it and think, surely this time, the gentle heiress is safe. Surely this is the protector she never had. But the calm was a facade, and behind it the same old loneliness was deepening. The marriage within a few years grew cold and distant. Sonny retreated further into seclusion, into drink, into prescription medication, into a quiet, isolated, increasingly fragile existence inside her beautiful homes. Claus moved in different circles, restless and ambitious, a man of expensive tastes married to a woman who controlled the money. The world saw a glittering von Bülow marriage at the top of society. Inside Clarendon Court there was a withdrawn, unhappy woman and a husband whose interests lay increasingly elsewhere, bound together by a marriage that no longer worked, and by a fortune that made leaving it enormously complicated. And then, in December of 1979, the surface cracked for the first time. It was the Christmas season of 1979 at Clarendon Court. Sonny von Bülow fell unconscious. She was found unresponsive, her breathing shallow, slipping into a coma. She was rushed to the hospital, and there, after treatment, she recovered. She woke. The doctors searched for a cause and found a confusing picture. Her blood sugar had crashed to a dangerously low level, a condition called hypoglycemia, the kind of thing that can come from many sources. She went home. The frightening episode was treated, at the time, as a one-off medical scare in a woman known to be in fragile health. Picture the household afterward. A beautiful, troubled woman who had nearly died for reasons no one could quite explain, returning to the silence of her mansion. A marriage already cold. A fortune sitting in the background, vast and waiting. And a question that, in hindsight, hung in the air unasked. Why had a healthy-blooded woman's body suddenly plunged into a near-fatal coma? At the time, no one called it anything but illness. But this first coma would become, in retrospect, the most important event of the entire story, because it established the pattern. A woman who should not, medically, have crashed into unconsciousness had done exactly that, and then recovered. If it happened once, by mysterious chance, it could happen again, and the next time there might be no waking up. It would not be the last time. Roughly 1 year later, almost to the season, it would happen again, and that second time would last 28 years. But to understand why the world came to suspect that these comas were not accidents at all, you have to understand what was happening inside that marriage in the year between them. Because in that year, the cracks became chasms. The distance between Sonny and Claus hardened into something colder. There were, it would later be alleged, profound tensions over money, over the marriage, over other relationships. The gentle, passive heiress and the charming, ambitious husband were locked in a slow, quiet crisis. And surrounding it all, always, was the fortune. The question of who would control it, who would inherit it, and what would happen to it if the marriage ended in divorce, rather than in something else. Hold that distinction in your mind, because the entire mystery turns on it. For a man married to a fortune he did not own, there is a vast difference between a wife who divorces you and takes the money with her, and a wife who dies or who simply never wakes up. That difference is measured in tens of millions of dollars, and it is the shadow that would fall over everything that happened next. The first coma was the warning. Almost no one heard it. To understand the tragedy that was coming, you have to understand the woman it happened to. Because Sonny von Bülow was, in the truest sense, the first and only real casualty of her own fortune. She was the inheritor, the single heir to George Crawford's empire, the one person who carried the whole weight of the family money, and she was almost uniquely unequipped to carry it. Where her father had been hard, shrewd, and self-protecting, Sonny was soft, trusting, and self-effacing. She did not love the spotlight. She hid from it. She did not command her fortune. She let others manage it. She wanted, by every account of those who knew her, the simplest and most unpurchasable things: to be loved, to be safe, to keep her family together, to avoid conflict at any cost. Picture her in those final conscious years. A wealthy, beautiful, profoundly lonely woman in a grand and silent house, increasingly dependent on alcohol and pills to get through her days, withdrawing further and further from a world that had only ever valued her for what she was worth. She had a fortune that could buy anything, and a life starved of the one thing it could not buy. And here is the true inheritance George Crawford passed down. Not the money, but the vulnerability the money created. He had taught his family that wealth was protection, but wealth had made his daughter a target her entire life. Chosen for her fortune, married for her fortune, surrounded by people whose interest in her could never be cleanly separated from her bank accounts. The wall of money he built to keep danger out had instead concentrated every danger in one place, and put his gentle, defenseless daughter at the center of it. What good is a fortune large enough to protect you from the whole if it cannot protect you from the people who are closest to you, the people the fortune itself drew near? The first tragedy. Not the coma, not yet. The deeper tragedy underneath it. That Sonny von Bülow lived her entire conscious life as a woman more valued for her money than for herself, and was, by temperament and by upbringing, utterly incapable of protecting herself from what that money attracted. She was a gentle person turned into a prize. And a prize, in the end, is a thing to be won, possessed, fought over, not a person to be loved. She had survived one mysterious coma. She had a fortune beyond counting. She had 3 children and a husband and 2 palatial homes. And she had, though no one yet knew it, almost exactly 1 year left of conscious life. To the outside world, the von Bülows remained a glittering society couple straight through 1980. They appeared together. They entertained. They occupied their place near the summit of New York and Newport society, the picture of aristocratic ease. The press, the social pages, the party guests all saw a wealthy, sophisticated marriage between a beautiful heiress and her urbane husband, the facade held. But behind it, by accounts that would later pour out in open court, the reality was very different. The marriage was by this point deeply troubled. Sonny was withdrawn and unwell. And Claus, it would be alleged, had formed a serious attachment to another woman, a relationship that gave him, in the eyes of those who later accused him, a powerful reason to want out of the marriage. And here the oldest, ugliest arithmetic in these stories appears again. A man who wants to leave a marriage but not the fortune faces a problem. Divorce means walking away with comparatively little. But if the wife should fall ill, if she should slip away, or simply never wake, the equation changes entirely. This is the suspicion that would soon consume the case. Whether it was true, a jury would eventually decide. But the motive, the means, and the opportunity were all about to be laid out in a courtroom for the world to see. The public saw a perfect couple. The private truth was about to break open on a bathroom floor. On December 21, 1980, at Clarendon Court, Sonny von Bülow was found unconscious again, collapsed on the floor of her bathroom, her body cold. This time, she did not recover. This time, there would be no waking up. And this times, her own children would begin to ask a terrifying question. Had someone done this to her? To understand why the world came to see Sonny's coma not as a tragedy but as a possible crime, you have to follow the money and the marriage into the year before she fell silent. By 1980, the von Bülow marriage was, behind its glittering surface, effectively broken. Sonny was withdrawn, unwell, drinking, and leaning on pills. And Claus, as by the account that prosecutors would later build, had fallen in love with another woman. An actress named Alexandra Isles who, it was alleged, was pressing him to leave his wife and marry her. And this is where the gentle heiress's fortune turned, in the eyes of her accusers, from a blessing into a death warrant. Because Claus von Bülow faced the oldest trap in these stories. He had given up his own career to live as the husband of a great fortune. But fortune was hers, not his. Under the terms that governed it, if he divorced Sonny, he would walk away comparatively poor. But if Sonny died while still married to him, he stood to inherit a vast sum, by later accounts, around $14 million. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. A living wife who divorced him meant near ruin. A dead wife meant a fortune and freedom both. I want to be scrupulously careful here, because this is the exact point where the story is most dangerous and most misunderstood. Everything I have just described. The affair, the financial motive, the pressure to leave, was the case the prosecution would make. It is motive, not proof. Claus von Bülow always maintained his innocence. He would in the end be acquitted, and the cause of Sonny's coma would never be established. So hold these as allegations, as the dark possibility that gripped the world, not as settled fact. The horror of this story is precisely that it was never resolved. But at the time, to the people closest to Sunny, the pattern looked damning. Cast your mind back to that first coma. Christmas 1979? The mysterious crash into unconsciousness that the doctors couldn't fully explain, and from which she recovered. Now set it beside everything happening in the marriage. The coldness, the other woman, the fortune that paid out only if Sunny died. To those who would later accuse Claus, the 1979 coma stopped looking like a medical accident and started looking like a rehearsal, a first attempt that failed when she unexpectedly woke up. So who betrayed Sunny von Bülow? That is the question that would consume 2 trials, a best-selling book, a Hollywood film, and the public imagination for decades. And it is the question that to this day has no certain answer. But step back from the courtroom for a moment and look at the deeper betrayal, the one that is not in doubt. Sunny was betrayed, first and most completely, by the very logic of her own fortune. She was a woman whose death was worth more than her life to someone close to her. That is true regardless of what happened on any bathroom floor. The fortune her father built to protect her had made her, by cold financial arithmetic, more valuable unconscious than awake. The other woman, the failing marriage, the secret financial machinery of who engine what, all of it converged by December of 1980 into a single, terrible vulnerability around one gentle, defenseless woman. This is the betrayal at the heart of the story. Not a proven act, but a proven condition. Sunny von Bülow lived inside a marriage and a fortune that had quietly made her worth more dead. Whether anyone acted on that arithmetic is the mystery. That the arithmetic existed at all is the tragedy. And the people who would force that question into the open were not the police. They were Sunny's own children, from her first marriage, the prince's children, who looked at their silent mother and refused to call it an accident. The next generation, Sunny's 3 children, is where this tragedy did something the others in this collection never quite did. It split the family clean down the middle and set the children against one another for the rest of their lives. There were 3 of them, Alla and Alexander von Auersperg, the prince's children, born in the late 1950s, now young adults, who adored their gentle mother and watched her fall silent. And Cosima von Bülow, born in 1967, Sunny and Claus's only child together. A teenager when her mother collapsed, and the one child who shared blood with the man about to be accused. And here the fortune did its cruelest generational work. When Alla and Alexander came to believe their stepfather had harmed their mother, the family did not grieve together. It shattered into 2 camps. On one side, the older children, convinced Claus was guilty, determined to see him prosecuted. On the other, Cosima, who stood loyally by her father, believed in his innocence, and could not accept that the man she loved had tried to murder the mother she also loved. Think about the impossible position of that teenage girl. To side with her mother's memory was to condemn her father. To stand by her father was to betray the cause of her own mother. There was no choice that did not cost her half her family. And waiting in the background, sharpening every division, was the fortune. Because the question of Claus's guilt was also, inescapably, the question of who would inherit and who would be cut out. The money turned a family's grief into a war. It was Alla and Alexander who acted. Frightened and suspicious after the first coma, they had already begun quietly to watch. And after the second, they did something extraordinary for grieving children to do. They hired private investigators to build a case against their own stepfather. And those investigators were about to find a small black bag that would turn a private family nightmare into the most sensational criminal trial of the decade. December 21st, 1980, Clarendon Court, Newport, the morning that divided Sunny von Bülow's life in 2 forever. She was found on the floor of her bathroom, unconscious and cold, having apparently been collapsed for some time. By the time she reached the hospital, the damage was catastrophic. Her brain had been deprived of oxygen for too long. The doctors stabilized her body, but the woman was, in every sense that mattered, gone. She did not die. That is the unbearable center of this story. Her heart kept beating. Her lungs, with help, kept breathing. But Sunny von Bülow had entered a persistent vegetative state, a coma from which she would never emerge, her eyes sometimes open but unseeing, her body present and herself utterly absent. She was 49 years old. And here the founder's whole philosophy collapses into a single hospital bed. George Crawford believed money was protection, that a fortune large enough could wall his daughter off from every danger in the world. Now look at what the fortune actually bought her. It could not stop whatever happened on that bathroom floor. And in its most grotesque irony, it could not even let her die. Because she was Sonny von Bülow, heiress to one of America's great fortunes. She would receive the most advanced, unlimited, around-the-clock medical care money could buy. Care that would keep her biological body alive, in that vegetative state, for the next 28 years. The wealth that failed to protect her now refused to release her. Sit with the horror of that number. 28 years. She fell unconscious in 1980, when the average house cost $60,000, and the Cold War was raging. She would not be released by death until 2008. Past the fall of the Berlin Wall, past the rise of the internet, into a century she would never know existed. For nearly 3 decades, her body lay in a private room, tended by nurses paid from her own bottomless fortune, while the world outside argued endlessly about how she got there. A living monument to the one thing her father's money could never buy, a peaceful, dignified end. What is the use of a fortune built to protect you, if it cannot prevent your destruction, and then will not even permit your rest? This is the point of no return. Before December 21st, 1980, Sonny von Bülow was a living, if unhappy, woman with a chance at a different life. After it, she was a silent body at the center of a storm. A fortune with no one inside it, around which her husband, her children, the law and the press would now wage a 28-year war. And the opening shot of that war was about to be fired by the private investigators her older children had hired. In the days after the coma, searching the family's belongings, they found a locked black bag. Inside it were vials, pills, and several used hypodermic needles. When tested, one of those needles, by the prosecution's account, bore traces of insulin on the outside. Sonny von Bülow was not a diabetic. She had no medical reason for insulin to be anywhere near her. So why was a needle encrusted with it sitting in a black bag inside her own home? The black bag turned a family's private agony into a public spectacle, unlike anything America had seen. Here is what the investigators said they found, and what the prosecution would build its case upon. A black leather bag, the kind a doctor might carry, containing pills, vials, and used hypodermic needles, and on at least one needle, traces of insulin. To Sonny's older children and the prosecutors, the meaning was electrifying and damning. Sonny was not diabetic. Insulin, injected into a non-diabetic, can crash blood sugar into exactly the kind of fatal hypoglycemic coma that had struck her down. Twice. Here, they believed, was the murder weapon. Physical evidence that someone had been injecting the heiress with insulin to kill, and disguise it as natural illness. In 1981, Klaus von Bülow was arrested and charged with twice attempting to murder his wife. The trial that followed, in 1982, was a sensation on a scale that's hard to convey. This was high society's deepest nightmare cracked open for public view. A Danish-born aristocrat accused of injecting his fabulously rich, comatose wife with insulin to inherit her fortune and run off with his mistress. The newspapers could not get enough. A real prince's children, an heiress frozen between life and death, a charming icy defendant, a fortune in the tens of millions, sex, money, and attempted murder in a Newport mansion. The public was transfixed, and in 1982 the jury convicted him. Klaus von Bülow was found guilty on 2 counts of attempted murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. It seemed for a moment that the story had its answer. The gentle heiress had been betrayed and nearly murdered by her own husband for her money, and the law had caught him. The wall of money had drawn in a killer, and justice had won. That is where the story stood in 1982, and if it had ended there, it would be a simpler, lesser tragedy. But it did not end there, because Klaus von Bülow had a fortune of legal options, and he used them. He hired one of the most brilliant appellate lawyers in America, the Harvard professor Alan Dershowitz, to overturn the conviction. And Dershowitz did something devastating to the prosecution's tidy story. He attacked the famous black bag and the insulin evidence itself, questioning how it was gathered by private investigators rather than police outside the proper chain of custody, and challenging the science of the insulin readings. He argued there was an entirely innocent explanation for Sonny's comas, that she was a deeply unwell woman, an alcoholic, a heavy user of sweets and sedatives with chronic low blood sugar, whose own fragile body, not her husband's hand, had crashed her into unconsciousness. He argued the prosecution's medical case was far shakier than it looked. In 1984, The conviction was overturned on appeal, and a new trial was ordered. And here is the devastation at the true heart of this story. Not a single horrifying act, but the dawning realization that we would never know. 2 comas, a black bag of needles, an insulin-tainted syringe, a husband with a mistress and 14 million reasons. And on the other side, a sick, addicted, fragile woman whose body might simply have given out on its own. Both stories fit the same silent body in the same hospital bed. And the one person who could have told us the truth, Sunny herself, would lie there for 28 years and never speak a word. The fortune had created the perfect unsolvable mystery. It built the motive. It funded the prosecution and the defense. It bought the investigators who found the evidence and the lawyer who tore it apart. And at the center of all of it lay a woman who could not testify, could not accuse, could not exonerate, a silence that money, for all its power, could never fill. Sunny von Bülow had become the most famous victim in America of a crime that might never have happened at all. At the very beginning, I told you that George Crawford built his fortune on a single conviction, and that it would fail his daughter completely. Stand now beside Sunny's hospital bed, in the long silence of her coma, and weigh what that belief truly cost. He believed money was protection, that a fortune large enough was a wall against every danger the world could throw at a person: poverty, helplessness, vulnerability, harm. He built that wall as high as almost any man of his age, and he left it standing around a 4-year-old girl he adored, certain it would keep her safe long after he was gone. And here is the terrible inversion that closes the loop. The wall did not keep danger out. It drew danger in. Every defining catastrophe of Sunny's life flowed directly from the fortune that was meant to protect her. It made her a prize to be married for, rather than a woman to be loved. It made her, by cold legal arithmetic, worth more dead than alive to the person closest to her. It surrounded her with people whose devotion could never be cleanly separated from her bank accounts. And in the end, whether by a needle or by her own failing body, it could neither save her life nor grant her death, but only suspend her. For 28 years, in a living tomb, its money kept perfectly maintained. That was the darkest secret of the Crawford fortune. Not a crime, because no crime was ever proven, but a truth, that great wealth does not protect the gentle. It exposes them. George Crawford spent his life believing he was building his daughter a fortress. He was building her a target and a cage. The kinder and more trusting she was. And Sunny was the kindest and most trusting of women, the more completely the fortune could be turned against her. What is the use of a wall built to keep the whole world out, if the danger you most needed protection from was already standing inside it, drawn there in the first place, by the wall itself? Sunny von Bülow lay silent. The fortune that defined her every breath could not give her back a single conscious moment. Her father's doctrine had run its full, terrible course, from a self-made man's dream of safety to a comatose woman in a Newport mansion, worth a fortune and unable to know she was alive. And the war over that fortune was about to enter its final, strangest phase. Because in 1985, Klaus von Bülow would stand trial a second time. And this time the verdict would be different, and it would settle nothing at all. In 1985, Klaus von Bülow went on trial a second time for the attempted murder of his wife. And this time, the outcome would be the exact opposite. The second trial was, if anything, an even greater spectacle than the first, but the ground had shifted. Armed with Dershowitz's strategy, the defense came in not to plead, but to dismantle. They put the prosecution's own medical evidence on trial. They brought in their own experts to argue that Sunny's comas were entirely consistent with her documented self-destruction. The heavy drinking, the sweets, the sedatives, the chronically unstable blood sugar of a woman in deep physical decline. They cast serious doubt on the insulin-tainted needle, how it was found, who handled it, whether the science meant what the first jury had been told it meant. The central question quietly transformed. In 1982, the jury had been asked, did this man inject his wife with insulin? By 1985, the defense had reframed it into something a jury could not get past. Can you be sure, beyond a reasonable doubt, that any crime happened at all? Maybe no one poisoned Sunny von Bülow. Maybe her own ravaged body had simply shut down, twice, the second time for good. And if the jury couldn't rule that out, they couldn't convict. They couldn't rule it out. On June 10, 1985, the jury acquitted Klaus von Bülow on all charges. He walked out of the courthouse a free man. And understand precisely what that verdict meant because it is the key to this entire story. Not guilty is not the same as innocent. The jury did not declare that Klaus von Bülow was a wronged man, or that Sonny had simply fallen ill. They declared that the state had not proven, beyond a reasonable doubt, that he had tried to kill her. The cause of Sonny von Bülow's coma was not established in that courtroom. It was left, permanently, in shadow. The law had spoken, and what it said was, in effect, we cannot know. 2 trials, 2 opposite verdicts. A conviction and an acquittal over the same silent body, the same black bag, the same insulin. The most expensive, most public, most exhaustively examined mystery in American high society had produced in the end the one thing fortunes are supposed to prevent: total, permanent uncertainty. Klaus von Bülow was free. Sonny von Bülow remained exactly where she had been since 1980. Silent, breathing, gone. The verdict changed his life completely. It changed hers not at all. And now the war moved out of the criminal courtroom and into the place it had always, secretly, been about: the fortune. Acquittal freed Klaus from prison. It did not free him from his wife's children, or from the question of the money. Sonny's older children, Alla and Alexander, were not bound by the criminal verdict. Convinced of his guilt and unwilling to let him profit, they launched a civil lawsuit against their stepfather, a suit reportedly seeking some $56 million in damages. The criminal case was over. The financial reckoning had just begun. And the settlement they reached, in the end, reveals what this whole saga had always truly been about. The terms were extraordinary. Klaus von Bülow agreed to divorce the comatose Sonny and to renounce every claim to her fortune, walking away from the millions he stood to inherit. In exchange, the children dropped the civil suit, and there was one more condition, the most telling of all: Cosima, Klaus and Sonny's daughter, who had loyally stood by her father throughout, would be restored to her place in her grandmother's inheritance, from which she had been cut out for taking his side. Look at what was actually traded. Klaus gave up the fortune and got his freedom and his name out of the courts. The children gave up the lawsuit and got the fortune kept away from the man they believed had harmed their mother, and got their sister back inside, the family inheritance. Every single term of that settlement was about money and who would receive it. The criminal trials had asked whether Sonny was murdered. The settlement asked the question the family had perhaps cared about most all along: who gets the money? And in answering it, they made the deal that finally ended the war. And notice who was entirely absent from every negotiation: Sonny. The woman whose body lay at the center of all of it, the prize, the victim, the silent point around which husband, children, lawyers, and reporters had circled for years, had no voice in what became of her own fortune, her own marriage, or her own children's futures. Decisions about her money, her divorce, and her legacy were made over her unconscious body. She had become, completely, an object to be settled rather than a person to be consulted. Klaus von Bülow left America, moved to London, and lived out a long life in quiet society until his death in 2019, the mystery intact to the end. And Sonny lay on. While the trials raged, the books were written, and a Hollywood film was made of her ordeal, Sonny von Bülow did the only thing left to her. She lay still, and the years passed over her. She was moved, eventually, to a private room, first in a hospital, later in a nursing facility in New York, and cared for, around the clock, by nurses funded from her own vast fortune. Her hair was kept brushed. Her body was tended. By accounts, her children visited, spoke to her, brought news she could not hear. The seasons turned outside her window for 28 years. Presidents came and went. Her grandchildren were born and grew up, and Sonny remained exactly as December 1980 had left her. Present and absent, alive and not, a candle that would neither burn nor go out. This is the part of the story that has no drama in it, and that is precisely why it is the most haunting. The trials were a spectacle. The silence was the truth. For nearly 3 decades, the woman at the center of one of the most sensational cases in American history simply existed, beyond reach of every fortune and every lawyer and every headline, a living illustration of the one thing money absolutely cannot buy back: a conscious human life. On December 6, 2008, Sonny von Bülow died at last, without ever having regained consciousness. She was 76 years old. She had spent 28 of those years, more than a third of her entire life, in a coma. She outlived the trials. She outlived the headlines. She very nearly outlived the public's memory of her own name. And when she finally died, The question that had defined her for 3 decades died with her, unanswered. She took the only testimony that mattered into the grave. The fortune endured, the mystery endured. Only Sonny was finally, mercifully gone. Lay the whole dynasty out, end to end. And look at what one man's belief finally produced. George Crawford, the founder, built a utilities empire and a fortune of tens of millions on a single conviction: that money was protection, a wall against every danger in the world. He died when his only daughter was 4, certain that the wealth he left would keep her safe forever. Sonny, the inheritor, grew up the richest little orphan in America, gentle, trusting, defenseless, and was married first for her fortune by a prince, then, by the account that gripped the world, very nearly killed for it by a second husband. She fell into a coma at 49 and lay silent for 28 years, her cause never known, her voice never heard again. Her children were split in 2 by the catastrophe, Allah and Alexander against Claus, Cosima beside him. A family turned into warring camps by suspicion and by the gravitational pull of the money underneath it all. And Claus von Bülow walked free, acquitted, the truth of that bathroom floor locked away with the one witness who could never speak. One cause sits beneath all of it. Not a proven crime, no crime was ever proven. The deepest cause was a belief, George Crawford's certainty that money is protection. That single conviction, built into the foundation of the family, was exactly wrong. Wealth did not protect his gentle daughter. It exposed her, made her a prize, a target, a body worth more silent than speaking. And then, in its final cruelty, kept that body alive for 28 years, when even death would have been a mercy. How does a fortune built to keep a little girl safe end with that same woman, frozen for 28 years at the center of an unsolved attempted murder? The same way these stories always end, when a family believes the money is a wall against the world, and never sees that the most dangerous things were already standing inside the wall, drawn there by the fortune itself. Be careful with the lesson, because this story more than any other punishes the easy answer. The lesson is not that Claus von Bülow was guilty. A jury acquitted him, and the truth was never established. To declare it now would be to do exactly what the courts refused to do. And the lesson is not that Sonny was a fool. She was a kind, gentle, trusting woman, and none of what happened to her was her fault. The villain was never the fortune itself, and uniquely in this story, it may not have been any person at all. The villain was the condition the fortune created. A world in which a gentle woman's death was worth more than her life to those around her. That condition is real, whether or not anyone ever acted on it. It is the quiet horror underneath the whole saga. Sonny von Bülow lived, for years, as a person whose continued existence was, to someone, an obstacle. No wall of money protects you from that. The wall of money builds it. For 28 years, the world stared at that bag and demanded not give up its secret, weapon or red herring, proof of murder or proof of nothing, and it never answered. That bag is the perfect emblem of the whole story. An object that seems to hold the truth and refuses to release it, exactly as the fortune itself seemed to promise safety and delivered the opposite. Sonny von Bülow had every advantage money could provide, and it could not buy her the 2 things she needed most. Someone who loved her more than her fortune, and, at the very end, the simple mercy of being allowed to rest. This is where the Crawford story stops being a scandal and becomes a mirror, because the bargain underneath it, mistaking wealth for safety, and a fortune for love, is one almost all of us are tempted to make. Sonny von Bülow is the proof of where it can end. There is a self-made man, somewhere at the start of this story, building an empire of light and power, and believing, with all his heart, that the fortune he made would keep his little girl safe from the world. He was wrong in the cruelest way a father can be wrong. The wall he built did not keep the danger out, it drew the danger in. It made his gentle daughter a prize to be won, a fortune to be married, and, in the story the world could never stop telling, a woman worth more, asleep than awake. She was called Sonny, for the brightness she brought into a room as a baby, and she spent the last 28 years of her life in a silence so complete that the truth of how she got there died with her. 2 trials, a conviction, an acquittal, a black bag that never gave up its secret, and at the center of all of it, a woman who could not say a single word in her own defense, or her own accusation, only lie still and wait, while the fortune that was meant to protect her kept her suspended between a life she couldn't live and a death she wasn't allowed. She had everything. She could not keep the only things that mattered.